So we've been looking at the guidance suggesting that in primary prevention we should be considering atorvastatin now instead of simvastatin. So we were thinking, well, do we need to consider switching people on simvastatin to atorvastatin? Our first PDSA cycle is simply to look at numbers of patients taking simvastatin and numbers of patients taking simvastatin in primary prevention. So the do element of that is obviously building the EMIS search. So we can do that. We can find patients taking simvastatin. And then we want to find the ones that aren't on a cardiovascular risk register or secondary prevention. So we build a search then that excludes people diabetic register, heart failure register, stroke, heart disease, kidney disease, or peripheral arterial disease. We can then get a figure 124 in my practice, which is an average size practice. I suppose the question then is, we've studied these people and we think, well, you know, they are on a statin, they're not on a secondary disease register. Do we need to change them? So one of the things we weren't sure of when we were looking at this then is well, you know, is the guidance explicitly saying we should change people from simvastatin to atorvastatin, or is this guidance for new patients starting a statin? And I think it is worth thinking, well, who might need changing? So we then thought, well, you know, why don't we consider looking at the ones who still have a high cholesterol despite being on a statin? So the plan then is to look at how many of these have still got a high cholesterol. So we then built a search. The doing is the building a search to look for people with cholesterol more than 4, and then the studying is we're looking at this data. Now, there's a couple of things that came out looking at these. We realised actually some of them haven't had their cholesterols checked for quite a while, and one of the things about that is actually there's a bit of ambiguity about whether we need to be doing cholesterols regularly in patients who are taking a statin for primary prevention. There's a school of thought that thinks, well, once you've started a statin, we don't need to keep chasing and targeting. Simply being on a statin is good enough in primary prevention. We also noticed that not all of them had had a Q-risk done ever, and we thought maybe we should be looking at that. We're still a little uncertain as to whether we should be switching them, but perhaps we should consider switching the ones whose last cholesterol is greater than 4. But we thought we should also look at how many have actually had a Q-risk done. So the next cycle was looking at Q-risks and were Q-risks done as part of this initial assessment. And then we then built another search. The do then is building another search to see were the Q-risks ever done. And we find that about half of them had had a Q-risk done, which was interesting in itself because clearly that wasn't half of them have started a statin without a Q-risk assessment. Some of these were historic. We studied and looked a bit further into that and wanted to know, well, how many of them would have been started on a statin now. And of the 60 that had a Q-risk ever done, only, well, about 80% of them were started because I guess the Q-risk was high. What was interesting is looking perhaps at patients whose cholesterol is still over 4 and what their Q-risk score was. And yes, 80% had a Q-risk over 10%, which means that 20% of those, you could argue, maybe don't need to be on a statin at all. And I think we're then hitting a point where we're thinking, well, hang on, you know, some of these patients, you could argue if we were rerunning Q-risk scores and we're using Q-risk 2 because that's the inbuilt score in EMIS, would we have put them on a statin at all? Do we want to change people that are on simvastatin to atorvastatin? We're not sure if that's clear from the guidance. We also want to be wary and careful of creating workload in practices. If we start to contact people, say, hey, we should change your statin, there can be unintended consequences. One of the things that we did notice, of course, when we were looking at simvastatin use in primary prevention is also that quite a high percentage of our simvastatin use is in secondary prevention. So we thought we should probably look at those patients too, and there may be more of an argument for changing people who are on simvastatin for secondary prevention to atorvastatin, particularly if their cholesterols aren't being managed aggressively enough. So the plan at this point then is to look at changing the focus of the project onto secondary prevention. The idea here being, we've noticed from studying the initial few rounds that we do have quite a lot of secondary prevention statins. And so the plan here is to look at that data. So we want to look for secondary prevention taking statin, and we also want to try and look at those by chronic disease categories if we can. And that's where we did a search then looking for those with secondary disease or secondary prevention taking statins. And about half our simvastatin users are in this group. And we can break them down by heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes, heart failure, peripheral arterial disease, and stroke. And we've got about 136 in my practice. The question then is, do we need to change them? And I guess if their latest cholesterol is over 4, there is more of an argument in this group saying these are the ones we should be targeting at the moment. And it's these patients where we should be thinking, hey, your last cholesterol is over 4, and we think it's worth considering more aggressive statin therapy for you. So, for example, for these 12 patients of mine who are on the heart disease register, we might contact those and say you should be on atorva. Now, that's just an audit, and that's an action from an audit. One of the things that we want to do is to look at, can we put in a change in practice that will deliver that improvement in quality of care going forward. And so at that point we're going to create an alert or a pop-up in EMIS that highlights for clinicians when they're seeing these patients that they should be considering more aggressive anti-lipid therapy than simvastatin. So we can create an alert that tells the clinician, hey, you're on simvastatin, and not to target for cholesterol, we should be considering another statin. We can also then change some of our chronic disease templates to highlight the fact that patients are taking simvastatin and their cholesterol is not well managed. And that would be the change that we want to put into practice going forward. That re-auditing cycle isn't going to be something we can re-audit in a short time frame, but it's something that we can put in as a change long term. The other observation from the project is around QRISK scoring. The guidance says QRISK 3. Now, QRISK 2 is the inbuilt calculator that's available to us in EMIS, and that can be run very quickly when we're seeing a patient. If we want to do a QRISK 3, we have to open up the QRISK 3 online calculator. The difficulty with the QRISK calculator is this isn't inbuilt inside of EMIS, so we would have to, for each patient, transpose their details over one by one, which is a disincentive to a clinician when they are reviewing a patient. We can create a search that can extract that data into a spreadsheet, and it may be worth considering something along the lines of a monthly search where any cholesterol is done for patients who aren't on a secondary disease register because they don't need QRISK, or patients who cholesterol isn't a target and aren't on lipids, that we can do a QRISK score to see, anti-lipid therapy, we can do a QRISK score to see if it's necessary. And I wonder whether we should consider encouraging a system of that sort in practices, but it did bring us to a wider point, which was how many patients need a cardiovascular risk assessment, and whether that's being done. Now, we know that some of this has slipped during COVID, but we thought it might be useful to estimate how many patients are eligible for cardiovascular risk assessments, as the plan in that stage is to look at how many patients are eligible for cardiovascular risk assessment, The DO is patients between 40 and 75, not on second prevention, not taking statins. And we find from that search that my average practice has 2,500 patients who may be eligible. Now, clearly, we know we're going to gradually catch up with our population screening, and COVID has interrupted things. But one of the things that we thought was useful is we can batch add the old QRISK-2 score to that population, and what we can do then is estimate how many of those patients we possibly should target for cardiovascular risk assessments first. So a QRISK score will put in an average result if there's missing information. So if there's missing blood pressure or missing weight or missing data, or if somebody's a non-smoker, it'll just, if we don't have smoking data, it'll suggest that somebody's a non-smoker. So what that gives is a conservative estimate, but these are the patients where we could consider targeting a cardiovascular risk assessment. And so the DO in this cycle is to batch add a QRISK-2 score to that population, which we did. And then the study is that we can look to see how many of those patients are likely to have risk scores over 10%. In my practice, it's 800. We might say, hey, let's start with the highest risks, which is 20%, and that was the old threshold. And I find there's 170 patients. So even if we haven't got currently a good process for calling everyone in over time, and we're trying to develop that, the project has meant that we could look at patients that we should consider targeting, so at least possibly looking at this 170 patients first, where we might say, hey, blood pressure, we really need to know their smoking status, their lipids, and that would be a nice clean outcome to come from it as well.